and welcome back to the Observations podcast. My name is Matt Davis, and in today's episode, we'll be talking about election observations in other parts of the world. I'm delighted to be joined by Jane Cooper, who has observed in elections in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, and multiple times in the Ukraine, in 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2015. Welcome to the show, Jane.
Thank you, Matt. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Now, to start us off, how did you get into electoral observation?
Okay, well, I was always interested in politics and elections. In high school, I actually took a course that included electoral systems and how they work, the difference between first past the post and proportional representation and ranked ballots, things like that. So that got me interested. I studied political science at university. Of course, I voting all the time in elections in Canada. And informally, when I started traveling early in my career, I observed electoral processes. So I saw the registration process for the independence referendum in Namibia. I saw a couple of quite contested elections in Sri Lanka when I was working there. And I saw one election in Ukraine early on. And I went to the US during presidential elections to see how the vote happened there. So I was very interested in electoral politics. But then I was very fortunate to be selected by the organization in Canada that works with the Canadian government to second observers to missions with the OSCE, so the Organization for Society and Cooperation in Europe. And that was really exciting. That was super interesting. The first election I observed was in Tajikistan, a country I'd worked in before, but I had not observed politics really closely in. So very interesting opportunity.
Okay, so you mentioned that observation can be a great way to explore topics of interest to you in a different country. What topics of interest have you explored through electoral observations?
Well, I would say there are many different things. What I always like about election observation is that really you have the mandate to ask almost anybody, almost anything, because it's all part of the context of the election. But I have always found it very interesting to look at local history, to understand the history of the country you're visiting. So, for instance, when I was in Ukraine, you can't really understand modern politics in Ukraine if you don't know a bit about the history of Ukraine, and for instance, the difference between the history of West Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, where in Western Ukraine, of course, was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the beginning of the last century, and then became part of Poland for the period between the two world wars, and then only joined the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Whereas the eastern part of Ukraine has been, was part of the Russian Empire for centuries. So big differences in how that history, and it reverberates down to politics today and the differences in Western Ukrainian politics and Eastern Ukrainian politics. So it's really, I think, useful and interesting to learn about those things, reading some history books. It's also very important in Ukraine, of course, to understand the number of people who died in the previous century in wars and in famines, right? Phenomenal death toll over the previous century, and that likewise reverberates into modern politics. But it's also a great opportunity to look at recent changes. So I observed in three Central Asian republics, which were all, what they call economies in transition, from a Soviet model to a capitalist model. And theoretically from a communist system of government to democracy. And so it was quite interesting to see the differences between those three countries, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and in how they took on different forms of democracy or didn't, and the growth in slide into autocratic government, particularly in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, and shrinking democracy. So very interesting. Also to see the similarities, because all of the former Soviet republics still use an electoral administration system that really is a hangover from the Soviet system, where they have very large polls and poll staff. So they'll have several thousand voters at one poll, and then the poll staff is maybe 10 or 12 people working together on a committee that then has to vote on election administration issues and vote on any complaints that come up. So that's quite different from how we run elections in Canada. and how they do it in the United States, and I think in a lot of other countries. So you need to understand the history. You also need to look at recent changes in the economy and politics to understand what's going on. And an election observation gives you the opportunity to learn all those things.
Okay, it's interesting what you mentioned there, that the structures that run these elections in some of these post-Soviet republics are the same structures.
Yeah, when you meet people working on elections on the poll staff and you ask them, oh, how long have you been doing this? I was meeting people who were like, well, I've been doing this for 20 years. I've worked on all the elections, and they worked on elections back in the Soviet period when, of course, there wasn't the competition that we would expect now, but there was still that process of, people did vote, they went to polls, they cast ballots, but the candidates that they had available to them were not necessarily representing a very wide range of political options.
Okay, now we're going to stop for a short break.
Some elections don't just choose governments, they change nations. On Observations, in the first series on historic general elections, we take you inside the ballot boxes of history. The moments when Britain's political landscape was turned upside down. The Great Reform Election of 1832, when the old order cracked and democracy began to widen. 1906, the liberal landslide that founded the welfare state. 1918, the coupon election, the first election after the Great War, after suffrage, seeing millions vote for the very first time, including women over 30. 1924, the first Labour government and its dramatic fall. 1929, the flapper election which saw women vote on an equal footing to men. 1997, Tony Blair and the New Labour sweeping away 18 years of conservative rule. And 2010, the dawn of coalition politics in the modern age. These were not just elections, they were turning points. They changed Great Britain. Join us on Observations in the coming weeks, the podcast that explores the votes, the voice, and the verdicts that defined a nation. History at the ballot box.
So you observed in Ukraine across multiple years. How has the internet changed campaigns in Ukraine?
Well, the internet's changed campaigning everywhere, of course, in all countries. But I was able to observe that kind of firsthand in Ukraine. When I was first there in 2010, the internet did not play a huge role. 2010 is pre-smartphone era. Seems like not that long ago, but people didn't have smartphones in 2010. And of course, by the end of the period that I was observing, so 2015, smartphone was a big thing. So access to social media became very widespread. So of course, all kinds of information and disinformation rapidly being spread around. Also, a new mode of advertising. So where when we first observed, the main mode of advertising was billboards, newspaper information, posters, things like that. By 2015, of course, you had ads for your candidates popping up in your Facebook feed all the time. So that did make a difference. So those things have changed.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there was an internet meme that impacted one of the elections. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so in 2012, there was a fairly sort of humorous story, but interesting and telling story in where I was observing. So there was a young man who was a candidate, or had been a candidate at the municipal level, and he got very annoyed with local government and the ruling party. And so he put up a billboard, and I don't know if we can see this little image here. He put up a billboard of this grandmother with her cat, and the text on the this is a refrigerator magnet, but it was a billboard at the time. The text said, "When I found out my grandson was voting for the Party of Regions, I decided to leave the house to the cat." So it's just a negative, humorous kind of comment about the ruling party. And the billboard itself, of course, only lasted about 3 days, and local government had it taken down because it was they were offended. Um, And in a pre-internet days, that would have been a very small scale protest that didn't go very far. But because it was, the growth of social media, the billboard was photographed and it was distributed on social media, and it went far and wide. And people even in neighboring countries were laughing at this joke. And it reached the point of a national stage where I saw a sketch on the Kvartal 95 sketch comedy show, which of course was the troupe run by Vladimir Zelensky, where they use this meme and this little story to do a humorous sketch about local people protesting against the government. So it was a good example, because at that point in time, I think the local government officials thought they could just take down a billboard and the story would disappear. And au contraire, because of social media, it became a national story. And so that is, we were just at that changing point in time when there were people who didn't quite understand yet the role that social media would play. Now, nobody is surprised when information and disinformation are spread very rapidly on the internet. There's no question. And so, what that means for election observation is that election observers now actually have to observe social media. When I first was an observer, the focus of your media observations tended to be on the print media, newspapers, magazines, and on local television. And in Ukraine and like countries all over the world, print media is rapidly shrinking. Not a lot of people reading the newspapers, not a lot of newspapers to read. Television is still there, but less and less important, particularly state television. So we would observe, even 2015, I observed state television, and I could see that state television was promoting one candidate over the others, giving that candidate much more time on air. However, the bottom line was nobody was watching state TV, right? That's not where people were getting their information. They were looking at Facebook. They were looking at all kinds of internet websites, news sites, local news. So now election observers internationally and anywhere else have to monitor social media if they want to understand the information available to the voters. And when you're an observer, that is one of the main things that you want to understand, is whether or not the voters have enough accurate information available to them to make a rational choice about who to vote for. So you have to look at social media. And the OSCE has now produced a very detailed and useful booklet with a methodology for observers to follow social media in a kind of scientific way, so that they can comment on what they've seen on social media and how that impacts the ability of voters to make a good decision.
Well, it's good to hear that there are some guidelines out there now. So I was wondering, what surprised you most about observing in Ukraine?
Well, okay, there were always many things that many surprises you find when you visit a new country. That's why it's great to go to new countries and see new things. I would say that one of the things that surprised me in Ukraine was the way that most people that you met really did want the system to work honestly. They really wanted that an honest democracy that was fair. However, they were pretty resigned to the shortcomings of the system they had, and they were very cynical. Say as a whole, a fairly cynical society Ukraine is. So on that, I think that cynicism fed into acceptance of things that were not always fair and honest. However, one of the other things that really surprised me in the long run was the rise of Zelensky, because when I was observing in 2015, he was a comedian. He was very successful. He had national stature, but he was very much a comedian, a political satirist. A lot of his comedy was focused on politics. He clearly had his finger on the pulse of politics so that he could satirize it. But I had not, at that stage, had not envisaged him becoming a politician. And in fact, of course, when he ran for election, he got the largest majority that any electoral candidate had got as president. And then when his party ran for parliamentary elections, they got a majority in the Rada, which no other party had ever got before. So that was really interesting to see that the people of Ukraine saw him as a different kind of candidate. They were the change he was the change they were looking for. And of course, we had no idea he was going to become the kind of international statesman that he has become. So those things are hard to see in the future. Who's going to be the big leader?
Mm-hmm. And is there anything else you'd like to mention about your time as an election observer?
Well, okay, I would say the big lessons for me being an international observer was really coming to understand the importance and the role of nonpartisan political observers in every country. And particularly in my country, I'm from Canada. And in Canada, we actually, our Election Act does not allow for nonpartisan observers in the polls. We only have party observers, so what we call scrutineers. Um, so I feel that's a shortcoming of the Canadian legislation, and the OSCE has actually commented to the Canadian government multiple times that we need to change our act to allow for nonpartisan observers in the polls, like democracy volunteers, right? Like you have in the UK. Um, I think that we need more people to be directly involved in elections as a safeguard for democracy. And people have, they have three options, and young people in particular, right? Three options. You can go and work for the election administration on an election day, and in most countries, the government is scrambling to find enough people to fill all the posts at the polls. So it's always a great opportunity for young people to learn more about democracy by going and working for their elections officials. They can also sign up to be a party observer. Parties are always looking for people to observe on their behalf in the polls. But for people who haven't aligned with any political party, it is really great if there is an opportunity for people to sign up with an organization that provides a neutral, nonpartisan observation team. And I think all of those things are really important. I mean, for an example, in Canada during our recent election, we had an election just a few months ago, and there was on social media, there were rumors circulating. There were people questioning, why do we use pencils to fill in our ballots? Which is something we've always done in Canada, right? Since there weren't many pens around and pencils were the thing, we've used pencils to fill in our ballots. It's a very simple and efficient and cheap way to for the elections officials to provide a writing tool. But people were questioning, well, if you fill in your ballot in pencil, somebody could erase your X, they could change your vote. And I felt, when I heard that only people who had never really spent any time inside a poll would worry about that. Because if you spent any time inside the poll, you would know that the ballots are never unsupervised, and there's no opportunity for somebody to erase your vote on a ballot. The ballots are always either inside a sealed ballot box, or immediately when they're taken out of the ballot box, they are counted in front of other observers. So that little rumor really demonstrated to me that we need more people spending more time inside our polls so that they can understand how the system really works. And that, I think, can build trust in democracy. And trust in democracy is a very valuable thing, especially in this era when a lot of political players are trying to introduce mistrust in the system. We need to build that trust, and observation is a really great way to build trust in the system.
And is there any way for people to learn more about your experiences?
Well, okay, I wrote this book about my experiences in Ukraine. It's travel writing and political writing mixed together from the McGill Queen's University Press. So if you're interested in learning more about what it's like to be an election observer, you could always read my book.
Okay, thank you very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Matt. Great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Observations podcast. If you found yourself interested in elections in Ukraine, do check out our episode on the 2004 election in Ukraine and the Orange Revolution. And if you're interested in what observers do closer to home, check out our episodes where we talk with democracy volunteers about their observations in Norway, Finland, and the English local elections. Do follow us wherever you are listening. A little reminder that we are also available on YouTube at Observations Podcast, where you'll be able to actually see the billboard turned fridge magnet mentioned earlier on. If you're already listening there, please do like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us greatly. My name is Matt Davis. Thank you for listening to the Observations Podcast.
The Observations podcast is being brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.